Hi, welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Show. So, I'm sure that if you watch this show, you also have been watching what's happening in Israel for the past week. And it's not a good week. It hasn't been a good week. It's been a very hard week for us here in Israel. And, we're facing a situation where we're coming up short in what is supposed to be a decisive battle about judicial reform, which is really not just about judicial reform. It's about the restoration of democratic norms and representative democracy in Israel. You know, one of the very famous books that came out, one of the bestsellers that really crystallized the issue for the nationalist camp in Israel, came out a couple of years ago. It was written by my colleague, Erez Tedmor, and Erez wrote a book that was titled, "Why Do You Vote for the Right and Get the Left?" Because since Menachem Begin was first elected in 1977, and finally brought the right to power after 29 years of leftist reign under the Mapai Party, under the Labor Zionists, you got these right-wing governments that were really just putting on nationalist gloss on the same policies that we had been getting from the left. And as the left radicalized more and more, you got increasingly radical policies from right-wing governments. So it was a question on everybody's mind, and Erez's book kind of crystallized it. And what everybody who analyzes this question, and I've been writing about it for over 20 years, comes away with is that, over time, as we talked about last week in the show with Yoram Chazoni, you had two efforts by the left. One was policy. It was surrender to the Palestinians in order to try to embrace this concept that was put forward by the Europeans and the American left, that the reason that there wasn't peace in the Middle East is because Israel was too big, and if we yielded land in Judea and Samaria and Gaza to the PLO, that they would be appeased and we would have peace, and then the Europeans would love us and it would all be wonderful and we could join them in the European Union, or at least in that common sense. And on the other hand, the Supreme Court began acting as like an oracle, as a high priest, where they were not only adjudicating every dispute they wanted by abandoning standing requirements, they also started using extra legal defenses for their rulings, so that they would rule not based on law and their interpretation of standing of statute. They began systematically making rulings based on their completely subjective concept of what is reasonable or unreasonable, or proportionate or disproportionate. These are all obviously subjective concepts that they were using in order to assert dictatorial powers and act as an oligarchy that is unelected, self-appointed through our judicial selection process, and unaccountable to voters or to our representatives in the Knesset and the government. So, as it became apparent that our democracy had been gutted while we were, busy living our lives, people started paying more and more attention to the legal fraternity. And then when they concocted charges against Netanyahu, and they invented a concept of bribery that doesn't actually exist in the law, that a politician who seeks positive coverage from a media organization is soliciting a bribe. And since he tried to get good coverage, in their opinion, from a minor website, that he was actually soliciting a bribe from this website, they insisted that he was soliciting a bribe. So this was insane. It didn't make sense, and in the event, it worked out that he never even tried to get good coverage from them. But be that as it may, he was railroaded by the state prosecutor. He was railroaded by the state prosecution, and we ended up in this situation. So the last election that happened after all of the charges that they put forward against Netanyahu had already fallen apart on the witness stand in the District Court of Jerusalem. The last election was about judicial reform. It was about restoring checks and balances to our out of control, unchecked, unbalanced judiciary and the Attorney General. And we went to the polls and we voted and we won. And then this mob appeared. It was funded by Yesh Atid billionaires who founded Yair Lapid's party, Yesh Atid. Yair Lapid's party is the opposition leader, but it's not really a party. It's like a stage crew. They don't run in primaries. They're not accountable to voters. The 24 members of Knesset that operate under the aegis of Yesh Atid, they're selected by billionaires who have auditions for them before, after elections are called. And if you pass the cut, then you get a high position on the list. And if you don't, you don't. And that's how it works. I mean, it's very odd, and it's completely not democratic. But that's our opposition party. And the billionaires that have funded this effort, called Yesh Atid, they're high-tech billionaires, and they've been putting millions of dollars into this. You have the New Israel Fund, which is a progressive Jewish organization in the United States, and they've been funding it. You have the State Department, which, as Roni Sassover exposed for the first time on this show, is the State Department, which is funding the Movement of Quality Government. And the Movement for Quality Government is a lawfare organization, a domestic one, that uses the Supreme Court and its radical justices to actually carry out lawfare against the government. So it was, we talked a lot about the fact that the court made a ruling a month and a half ago blocking Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas party, which is a coalition partner, from serving as a minister in the government. 400,000 people voted for Shas and expected that the head of their party would be in the government. The Netanyahu duly appointed him to serve as Minister of Health and Minister of the Interior in his government, and the Knesset duly confirmed his appointment. And then, based on no law whatsoever, the Supreme Court, acting in conjunction with the Movement of Quality Government, really instigated this entire riotous atmosphere in Israel by saying that it was unreasonable for him to serve as a minister in the government, and therefore compelled Netanyahu to fire him. And they're planning on doing the same thing, I would assume, with Netanyahu in another outrageous, legally unsupportable, and unbased petition by the Movement of Quality Government, which is funded by the State Department, to tell Netanyahu that he's not allowed to serve as prime minister, even though the Knesset passed a law explicitly allowing somebody who's on trial, and even somebody who's convicted, to serve as prime minister in order to block the legal fraternity from ousting a sitting prime minister. So you have this crazy situation where we have an oligarchy that is setting this country on fire in order to maintain its power and its privilege, and it's succeeding because it works out that indeed it is more powerful than the Knesset, and it is more powerful than the government, and it is more powerful at the end of the day than we the people. But I've been walking around very low for the past couple of days. All of us have. I gave 2 radio interviews this morning. I'm going to give another 2 interviews this evening. And I'm doing this show. And what was funny was that, and if you look at my Twitter feed, if you do Google Translate, you see that I'm sort of I've been moving like a slalom skier. I keep saying, well, we can't give up. We can't stand down. And then I said, we have to stand down because we want this so badly, because it's so necessary that we restore governance to this city, this society, this country. But we came into this battle unprepared. I mean, Yariv Levin, the Justice Minister, I don't think he stopped to think, what this system that opposes us was going to look like. We had already seen leftist mobs outside of the prime minister's residence starting in 2019, 2020, with the sudden appearance of this very well-funded group like Antifa in the United States of goons, of very violent protesters that call themselves crime minister. Ha ha, how cute, because Netanyahu is a criminal, right? So they were destabilizing the government. They were destabilizing public life in Israel. And they were in lockdowns and Corona. The police allowed them, the courts allowed them to continue having mass protests because, just like Black Lives Matter in the United States, they were on the right side, and therefore the laws that everybody who was restricted to our homes were forced to abide by of not congregating, not having bar mitzvahs, not having weddings with more than 50 members, you could have, a couple thousand lonely people gathering together outside of the prime minister's residence in Jerusalem and rioting because right to protest, but only for them, right? And the same thing that you had in the United States, if you're watching from there with the Black Lives Matter riots of 2020. So, they were allowed to riot here because they were on the right side of the legal fraternity. So that was the beginning of this kind of mob. But what we're seeing today is the prime minister exponentially expanded, because the media in Israel has been running a campaign that the likes of which we never saw, of incitement against this government, of demonizing the government, of demonizing the reforms, of demonizing the voters. I mean, you don't see this anywhere, the kind of grotesque racism and racialism that tinges their remarks when they talk about members of the coalition. They're primitive, they talk funny Hebrew, right? Because they come from Morocco or they come from Yemen instead of from Poland or whatever. I mean, we haven't heard this kind of language in Israel so openly ever, and we haven't seen this kind of racist attitude on the part of our elites so openly expressed, at least since the very early, since like, I don't know, the 1980s or the 1970s. So it became politically incorrect. But now open racism against Sephardic Jews, against Mizrahi Jews, and against religious Jews. You hear over and over again, anytime that somebody's wearing a kippah or looks a little bit religious, people talk about a halachic state, that a state's going to be governed by Torah law. This is stupid because, nobody's asking at all, nobody, not the ultra-Orthodox, not the religious Zionists, not the Likud. Nobody in this coalition is calling for a state to replace Israel's legal code with the Torah law. But on the other hand, you have a lot of traditional religious Jews in this coalition and among their voters. And what's wrong with that? It's pure nonsense, but you can't have a conversation because the minute that you try to have a conversation, they say democracy means rule by halakha. That the majority wants halachic rule. This is pure and utter garbage. It's total nonsense. Nobody's made a proposal like that. But this is why incitement is so powerful, because they've been incited. The people who are screaming these nonsensical, the total lies, they've been incited by the media. They're watching TV. I've said a lot on TV, on Channel 14, our one right-wing station, and without which, by the way, the right wouldn't have won the elections. And there wouldn't be a reform proposal on the table at all. We've heard, people say the media, it's not that powerful. It isn't powerful in the sense that they don't convince the unconvinced, although I'm sure that over the years they've lowered the number of people who are on the right pretty significantly. But they are able to mobilize the left. They are able to mobilize leftists. I have all of us, everybody on the right has friends and relatives on the left. And suddenly, because of the incitement of the media and of people like Yair Lapid, and because of the riots and the rallies and the togetherness that they feel, this ecstasy of being part of a mob, of being together after 2 years of Corona, you hear people who were your friends, who you talked to for decades, and they're completely incited and they hate you. They hate everything you stand for. They say that you're going to destroy the country. None of this is true. But you can't have a conversation anymore because these people have been incited. So I said, well, you know what? This is why I go back and forth, right? We finally got to the point where we have an electoral majority. We won. And we have the legal right and a mandate to make the changes that Yariv Levin put forward. And I thought that they were milquetoast. I thought that they were too small. And they've already been watered down to almost nothing except for political control over the judicial selection process. So why would I want to go back to the drawing board and not go forward with this? Because we can't win. At this point, in this atmosphere, under these constraints, and it's better to walk away than reach a point where we're breaking, we're compromising the most important things just to, get something. We're not going to, in the end, it'll be worse than it was before. And in the meantime, the threats against us keep growing and growing and growing. Iran either has crossed the nuclear threshold or it's about to cross the nuclear threshold. At any rate, it's a threshold nuclear state, and we have to push it back. We have to take action. The Americans, General Milley said last week that the United States will not allow Iran to have a fieldable, or won't accept an Iran with a fieldable nuclear weapon, which means that they're fine with an Iranian nuclear arsenal if it's kept in the box, as Secretary of State Blinken likes to say, whatever a box is. A box of bombs, right? A box, an armory. That's a box. I mean, defined box, right? So unless they feel that, so the United States is cool with Iran becoming a nuclear state under the Biden administration, which means that Israel is alone. Saudi Arabia and Iran just mended fences under the aegis of Beijing. And the Saudis that I've spoken to over the past week, they say that they're fine. They believe that Beijing is going to defend them against Iran. Good luck with that. But that means that, we're not going to get the kind of normalization in all likelihood with the Saudis that we had anticipated. The chaos inside of Israel is also, they're using their power. The leftists, this mob of leftists, they're also using their power to undermine our position internationally. You have the former Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, who last week, literally on live television, did what I can only consider the treasonous act of calling for other countries to boycott the government of Israel. So, and gets away with it because the media agrees with them. So, we have these kinds of things going on, and we're not going to win this battle. Even if we pass the law, we're going to lose it. So, as much as every bone and sinew in my body says we cannot walk away from this and we cannot back down, the fact is that a tactical retreat is required, because anything that we pass is going to be ridden on water, and we have things that we have to do. Netanyahu was elected 30 years ago. 30 years ago this week, we marked the 30th anniversary of his first election to lead the Likud after Shamir lost the 1992 elections, and then he was the opposition leader until 1993. So Rabin formed a government, and Netanyahu went from being a first-time legislator. He was elected for the first time in 1988 when he returned from the UN, where he was our ambassador. And then in 1993, after a mere 5 years in office, he was catapulted to lead the Likud because he was better than everybody else. And he still is. But for 30 years as the head of the Likud, aside from being opposed to Oslo and the process that we went forward on with this insane idea that if you empower terrorists, that they're going to become your friends, as opposed to simply becoming what they did become, which is more powerful terrorists and more radicalized terrorists. The banner that he's been operating under has been the banner of preventing Iran from becoming an existential threat to Israel through nuclear power and regional hegemony. He said very clearly in a number of interviews when his book came out last year that the only reason that he's back in office, the only reason that he remained head of opposition instead of retiring, copying a plea, and going out and making millions of dollars is because he wanted to fight Iran. He wanted to block Iran from becoming a nuclear armed state. Now, when it's very clear that America is not on our side in this fight, now when it's clear that we can only have allies if we're willing to go it alone. And we need to walk away from this morass. We need to stabilize things in this government. We need to get the army back on track. The army is politicized. They're siding with the protesters against the government, which is why he had to fire Defense Minister, just parenthetically, Yoav Gallant this week on Sunday, because Yoav Gallant was siding with the army, which was siding with the mob against the government, and you cannot have a defense minister who's part of a mutiny against the government. You just can't. I mean, as Begin famously once said, the defense minister is supposed to be the government's representative to the army, not the army's representative to the government. And Gallant failed this test. He was disloyal and he had to go. So that's just the way it is. And we need to get a new defense minister in power who's going to be able to bring the general staff to heel and get organized and take care of business. And then, in the future, hopefully in this Knesset, we'll be able to revisit this, but from a position of strength. Because right now, it took 2 months of chaos and chaotic negotiations to form this coalition, and that was a failure. But you lost 2 months of momentum, and you gave 2 months to the other side to organize. And this is an opposition that, like the Democrats under Trump, are not a loyal opposition. They see themselves as a resistance movement, and they're not loyal to this government, and they're not loyal to the democratic norms. They're loyal to what they consider a higher power, which is a Supreme Court and the legal fraternity that protects the left's privilege and power even when they're out of office. And they're fomenting and perfectly willing to fight a civil war against this government to overthrow the people's will. And I'll just say one last thing because I don't want to go too long on this opening. But I'm very torn or diffident about Menachem Begin because he stood down, because he finally won power in 1977 and he just gave the keys to the realm back to the left. And that, as Erez Tadmor was writing in his book, Why Do We Vote Right and We Get Left? That was a profound act of weakness and betrayal of the right-wing voters and loyalists to Begin that had followed him in the political wilderness for 29 years. At great personal cost, I'll add. And you wonder why he did it. And I think we're seeing this week why he did it. Because in the pre-state era, when Begin was the head of the Etzel, or what you know in America as the Irgun, the underground movement against the British Mandate, he was hounded. His men were hounded and betrayed, and in one instance murdered by the socialist Zionists led by Ben Gurion and by the Pamach and by the Haganah. And then in 1948, Ben Gurion ordered Yitzhak Rabin, who was the head of the Pamach, to open fire on the Altalena, a weapon ship that was bringing incredibly important, decisive weapons to the units of the new IDF that were organized under the banner of the Etzel to fight. And despite their encirclement, despite the extraordinary shortage of ammunition and guns on the part of Israel at that juncture, Ben-Gurion ordered Rabin to sink the Altalena and kill the people on the deck of the ship. And it was an act of war of the labor Zionists against the revisionists. And Begin ordered his men not to shoot back, not to defend themselves, not to open fire against Rabin and his men on the shore in Tel Aviv that were killing them. And the reason why Begin did that is because he wanted to prevent a civil war. And he understood that this country was more important than power. And preserving this country and protecting it and enabling it to defeat the Arabs was more important than defeating a left that was murderous and full of hate and willing to kill in order to maintain power. And, generations of right-wingers have had to deal with this legacy. And I think that today, when we see the way that the left is treating us and our elected leaders, when we see the way that they talk about us, when we see the way that they trash our good names, we can understand what was driving Begin, because above everything else is the state. And these people will be brought to heel because, we are not the Israeli right of 1977 that was used to being oppressed and put down and blocked from positions of power and influence in this country in every single institution of this country. You know, we went to vote. We have, journalists, we have authors, we have academics who, of course, don't have positions in universities, but all the same, who understand the game. And we're not willing to stand idly by and let it continue on. So this is why I believe that, as opposed to what Begin did in 1977, where he beat a strategic retreat and he gave the left 2 more generations of unchallenged power over the institutions of this country, during which time they only became more radical. The right has had enough of it. So this is, in fact, a tactical retreat. We need to regroup. We need to be able to look at this blob, this system against us, and start taking it apart. In a radio interview this morning, I said it's like a clenched fist. The left has never been more united. And in order to be able to carry out the kind of reforms we need to restore our democracy, we need to be able to, one by one, open it up, pick up the fingers, and then take them and deal with them one by one, because you can't deal with a clenched fist, which, by the way, is a symbol of the mob violence that we're seeing in the streets of our country today. So I think, we've seen this, and what's been seen will not be unseen. What's been experienced will not be unexperienced. And this, unfortunately, we fought a long war to get here. We're going to have to fight for longer. Maybe we'll have to fight forever, but nothing is more precious than the state of Israel, and we won't give up, and we'll prevail. We'll prevail against Iran. We'll prevail against Hezbollah, and we'll even prevail against the elites that are trying to block us from restoring our democracy. The people's will, as they say, will be done. If not today, then tomorrow.